All right, so let's get started. This is the How to Write a Case NEG elective. If you are not in this elective, you are in the wrong place. Sort of going to break this up in a couple of pieces. So, going to start with what is a case NEG. Then we'll talk a little bit about why you should write one, and then how you should write one. So, pretty simple. My guess is that you are in your labs currently writing case NEGs for specific labs. Yeah, so that sounds about right. So we'll be sort of talking about like how to do it proficiently. Okay. Subpoint one, what is a case neg? A case neg is a file that includes answers to advantages and add-ons, case-specific off-case strategies, and link insolvency supplements for generics. I'll repeat that again. A case neg includes answers to advantages and add-ons, case-specific off-case strategies, and link solvency supplements for generics. So I'll break that definition up a little bit, right? You definitely want answers to the set of one AC advantages that they've provided. And then once you know if they have two AC add-ons, you want answers to those two AC add-ons as well. And generally speaking, those look like front lines that have multiple answers to each advantage, okay? You also want case-specific off-case strategies in your case deck. So, you might have found that, while our generics are wonderful, that they might not fill a 1NC, slash, they might not be all that specific to the affirmatives that you have. So, like, for example, I know, like, one of the affs is about, US NATO partnerships with India. It's like, I'm not sure that our generics have lots of links about India. I'm willing to potentially say there is. So that kind of means that you have to put together some off-case strategies that are specific to affirmatives. And then lastly, you need to have sort of additional link insolvency supplements for specific Fs. So if you are, taking a look at the DOS counterplan as a strategy you really want to read, it's like you probably need some cards that say the DOS can solve, in this case, like India stuff, right? It's like otherwise, your solvency stuff is only generally about security cooperation, which is like, B minus, but you kind of want to have specific things about your, case net, right? Similarly for the critique, it's like Virilio critique has some, a lot of Virilio 2007 cards. It's like, yeah, that's like fine, but probably not super specific to, for example, the AT Lab Space app. Like you probably can find some cards about satellites and Virilio, right? So it's like supplementing sort of existing files in addition to sort of those specific off-case strategies. Okay, so now that we sort of squared away the definition, why write a case neg? So writing a case neg is kind of a dying art. Okay, in the rush to sort of fall back to comfortable generic arguments, I think teams have gotten pretty complacent. So for K teams, it's kind of like you write one or two Ks, and then like you write some link walls maybe if we're lucky, and then like that's it. Like you don't write anything specific to the app. Or like if you're a policy team, you might be like there's like 3 or 4 counterplans that we like to cycle through and go for the 2NR. Like some sort of set of consult counterplans, conditions, DOS counterplan, and that's kind of it. I think top teams in the past too, like especially on huge topics, have sort of read 7 to 10 off of mostly bad stuff. And the AF win percentage is really high because they know how to put together two ACs to those really generic arguments. That's kind of a sad state of situation because most AFs are pretty bad and teams are not really ready to defend them. So most 1ACs that are written were thought in terms of like, how could it answer some of the generics that are here? No one really does the thinking that's just like, is this affirmative good enough to stand up on its own? And my guess is that in the rush to create your 1AC, you probably know, like in your own lab, there are some cards in your 1AC where you're like, I don't know, could have been better, slash, this could be a negative counterplan card, but it's going in anyway, right? And kind of means like writing a case negative is sort of a very easy way to break down a set of apps that exists, okay? The teams that know the most about your opponent's affirmative area tend to also get more speaker points. So how many of you have read judging philosophies that look something like, I really want to see a case? People need to read more judging philosophies. Like most judging philosophies are just like, yeah, we would love you to debate the case. It's like the thing that they're saying there is like, they're not literally saying like only go to the case. Like that's it. They're saying like they want case specific strategy, case specific link arguments, and arguments about the advantage, right? And it's like that's kind of the way that you get sort of from maybe like 28-2, 28-5 to like 29-29. Is like being able to debate about the affirmative in a way that is very good. Okay, let's talk about the process. I think there's an order of operations of how to write a case neg that is pretty much formulaic. And you should sort of follow this formula if you're writing a case neg right now, okay? The very first thing that you should do, is you should go to the plan text and read it. Okay, you should go to the plan text and read it. You should try to understand the scope of action that's being taken by the plan, right? So sort of a few notes underneath the sort of read a plan area. Like the first is, the plan in a vacuum is really important for T violations and to figure out what it's doing. So it's like, if you read the plan text and you're like, it doesn't say the word security cooperation, it says some other word. It's like, it's time to investigate what the other words they've decided to add into the plan are. So like, for example, like the AT lab affirmative about space, that plan text does not have the word security cooperation anywhere in the plan. It just says like the United States federal government should establish a CMMC standard, which is like a type of certification for like cyber assets for ground station satellites. It's like, okay, like given that, it's like, what is the certification process a part of security cooperation? It's like a pretty good question to ask. The other sort of second subpoint under this is like, you also want to think about why an affirmative is either being intentionally specific or intentionally vague about the way that they're writing their plan text. Okay, so let's start with intentionally specific. Why do you think the AT lab decided to not use the word security cooperation and just use the phrase established CMMC, strategically speaking? And you can be wrong, totally no big deal. Yeah. Okay, so the negative could pick out of security cooperation. So if the word security cooperation is not in there, like maybe, it helps with your perm text writing, what position would I be worried about in that case? Like, what position am I thinking about when I wrote that plan text? Yeah, but I mean, like, which generic am I thinking about specifically? Okay, why? Yeah, so like the word security cooperation does not exist in the plan. So like you can't be like you abolish security cooperation, do whatever, because like the 2AC can stand up and be like, well, we established CMMC standards and you can also abolish security cooperation. What else? Okay, you too, everybody on sort of the same boat. Okay, so like sometimes teams will be intentionally specific to try to avoid, counterplan competition debates. Okay. Like another reason why this might be the case is that they might specify something very, they might have something very specific in their plan in order to avoid a set of disadvantages or to generate a set of new advantages, right? So it's like the fact that the words established CMMC is in the plan is the reason why, for example, advantage two is like this procurement certification is good stuff, right? It's like, if you just said the word security cooperation, it'd be unclear how you got there. The fact that you jammed in the phrase certification allows you to generate that advantage. Okay, let's do the other way. So it's like sometimes teams are like intentionally vague about their plans. So let me give you an example, like from the water protection topic. I'm sure you've seen some plan text that looks something like the United States federal government should substantially increase its agricultural water protection, period. Or like CJR, like I think this was the worst one that I saw, was like the United States federal government should like substantially reform its like cyber logistical criminal justice reform. It's like makes no sense, but it's like a bunch of stuff, adjective, and then the words in the resolution. What are teams trying to do there when they insert all the words of the resolution and have an intentionally vague plan? What about it? Yeah, so beating T is usually the big reason, right? So it's like you think your app is kind of like vaguely not topical. So it's like you've added all the words of the resolution in there. So like people can't like you're kind of beyond reproach, right? Why else? Like why might be, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I don't know about like disads and k-links, but yes, reclarification of the plan is the other reason, right? So it's like, let's say the NEG is like, oh yeah, we have a bunch of circumvention arguments and like reasons why, a certain variation of CGR, some variation of water protection would fail. Like, I don't know, subsidies fail. It's like, oh, well, your RF is not. Like, we said, it's a version of water protection, like, no shot, right? Another reason might be like certain picks. So it's like the DOS counterplan is a bad example here, but it's like if somebody was like, how about we do all of the plan minus, a very small subset of something, it's like, well, that small subset of something is not a criminal justice reform or water protection or security cooperation, so like permanent, right? So it's like they've added some of those very intentional like vagaries into the plan to try to avoid some things. Yeah. It could, right? So if your if your process counter plan is not based off of the phrase security cooperation, yeah, it helps you generate sort of permutation arguments. So the reason why I'm sort of bringing this up is you really want to think about like, why did they write the plan in this way? Like teams are very deliberate about why they've done so. It's like figuring out what that is will help you write your negative strategy, right? Both in terms of knowing what the weakness of the app is. So like basically if they like shoved in security cooperation into the plan, it's a pretty good indication that it's not top like usually, right? Or the other sort of version is like you'll kind of know like what negative strategies are like kind of unworkable, right? So if you wrote let's say you're trying to put together the DOS counterplan versus the CMMC version of this app, it's like you can't make competition arguments off of a word that's not in the plan, right? It's like security cooperation is DoD, security assistance is DOS, is like an unworkable proposition for that permutation, right? So it's like instead, like the things you would need to cut then are, well, let me sort of pose it to you all. If you were trying to read the DOS counterplan against the space affirmative, what would be the set of cards you would want for your competition arguments if you can't just compete off the phrase security cooperation? Yeah. Yeah, so you could say that the plan does use security cooperation, right? So you might be like CMMC is security cooperation. Yeah. What would I agree with you in the abstract, like what would the rehighlight, so in your ideal world, what would that rehighlighted card say? Okay, so maybe the solvency advocate says the word security cooperation in it, and it's like you can generate sort of that link. Fair enough. Any other thoughts about this? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, so like the card I would want is like if I couldn't find the card that's like it is security cooperation, I would at least want the thing that's like the thing the plan is talking about is done by the DoD, right? So it's like you need something that's like the CMMC is a DoD program. It's like that's the way that you would establish competition, as opposed to having the phrase just security cooperation is. Because like that's not in the plan text. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? So it's like it kind of drives like what is the stuff that you need to cut is sort of based off of the plan text being written. Another sort of caveat to this is like kind of a sidebar from writing a case neg. This is sort of the reason why teams sometimes will break new plan text against certain teams. So it's like, if I'm like, oh, like this team really likes to go for topicality, like I'm about to shove all the resolutional words into the plan text. If I'm like, this team really likes process counterplans that compete off of the phrase security cooperation, the word security cooperation is coming out of the plan text. Like it's now like, very specific, been, really hard to sort of establish a link to. Or if teams really like picks, I would probably be as vague as possible and also shove in the word substantially, right? It's like you want to sort of think about how you write plan text based off of what negative strategies are. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the first step was, so that was a long first step. The first step was to read the plan text. Okay. Second step is you should start reading evidence. And the place that you should universally start, regardless of the kind of affirmative you're working on, is the 1AC solvency advocate or the link article that says the plan's key to solve the advantage. So you want to start with the 1AC solvency advocate or the link article that says the plan is key to solve an advantage. Those two things are largely identical, right? It's like both of those things, like, so like if an advantage, it's like, the plan is key to do whatever. It's like, that's the same thing as a solvency advocate. So there might be multiple in a 1AC, but it's like you want to read through those articles. The reason why is that usually those are the highest quality AF cards that the AF is banking on to win against counterplans and to win against case arguments, right? And you sort of want to read for the following things. It's like you want to read. So like the easiest place to find some stuff is to look at the recommendation section of any of these solvency advocates. Usually there will be one at the conclusion or probably like a chapter before the conclusion. And usually it'll include a set of solvency advocates and counterpoints. Solvency takeouts and counterpoints. So it's like, you should remember like the AF can only increase security cooperation with NATO, right? That is the constraint set by the topic. So a lot of times when people are writing these articles, they're not thinking about like the high school debate topic. So they're including a bunch of different recommendations, usually not just NATO and usually not just the DoD. So like they might be like the Department of State should go do X, Y, and Z. Like we should go do stuff with the EU. We should also increase things that are not related to security cooperation that solve the advantage area, right? Those also, if you like think about them, you know, in an inverse way, are alternative causes or solvency takeouts. The AF, it's like the AF did not do this recommendation, did not, you know, go do stuff with the EU, did not go do stuff with whatever. It's like those are things that you can highlight in sort of, you know, your solvency front line to explain why the AF fails. Okay. You know, sometimes, you know, if a plan is, you know, talking about a specific bill, it's not really something that's happened at the DDI and don't really think it's all that strategic. But you might have seen like teams do something like the United States federal government should pass a like bill name sometimes. A lot of times that bill will include a bunch of different things that are not security cooperation. And you could probably find a set of topicality arguments based on it. Do you have a question? I mean, to an extent, although it's like it's not like, you know, books are untouchable. It's like a lot of them are online. If you're at the DDI, I would just, you know, go to the library and find the book, right? So like, yeah, like it would be nice. Like books are good generally in solvency advocates because they tend to be higher quality and they also tend to be focused. So like, I don't know if you all were like paying attention to the Rosenberg lecture, but he had like that suggestion about like that kill chain book, like the one about like the Department of Defense and procurement and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, like books will have some good stuff in them. That being said, it's like books also tend to be like large. So they're obviously not just covering, like, there's no book that's like, you know, the only thing we covered in this book is that the United States federal government should increase its security cooperation with NATO over the following 3 areas. It's like, there's like no shot that that's the case. So it's like, you'll likely be able to find a bunch of these different recommendations. Sort of related to the recommendations, you know, this might be true of most of your affirmatives, but like, almost every AF that's talking about emerging technology is talking about emerging disruptive technology as a whole. They're not just talking about AI. They're not just talking about biotechnology only or cyber only. Right? A lot of times they're talking about like, yeah, the US and China are racing. China's like potentially ahead on 5G, quantum computing, like whatever is happening. It's like, those are not like in any of the 3 areas, right? Or like nanotechnology. It's like, that's none of the 3 areas. So a lot of times you'll find in their solvency advocate, just like literally like you only did the first part and then there's like 3 comment items that you just did not do, right? It's like that can be a set of alternative causality arguments that you can establish, or it could be another counterplan. So sometimes articles will include, you know, alternative mechanisms, right? So they'll be like work with the DOS, work with the UN, work with the G20, work with the G7. They might have a bunch of different agents and it's like those can be their own thing. So like, for example, I know like the CMMC app, it's like there's a set of cards that says the Department of Commerce should do some procurement stuff. It's like, yeah, we don't have the Department of Commerce counterplan written, but it's like that's something that would be pretty valuable for you to write in your, you know, case neg, right? As opposed to, so it's like in that case, it's like I would probably read that counterplan instead of the DOS counterplan. It seems more specific to the AF. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? Okay. Third step. So we've read the plan, we've read solvency advocates. The next set of things that you kind of want to read is the 1AC internal links to advantages and then the 1AC impact cards. Okay. Usually the cards that I'm sort of talking about here are describing holistic problem areas. So usually internal link cards. So like the cards that are like, for example, like ground station satellites or like key to stop US-Russia war. It's like that article is probably not just talking about satellite ground stations. It probably comes from a larger article that's like problems with US-Russia relations, of which ground stations was a large paragraph or section of this. But it's like, it's probably not the case that it's only talking about ground stations. Like it's probably talking about a laundry list of things that are happening with Russia right now, right? It's like you can probably cut some of those to find both counterplans and also, alternative causes. Similar thought about impact cards, right? So like impact cards usually are just like, there's this huge thing happening, it causes extinction. It's like everything around it is probably talking about probably something else, right? So like econ decline cards tend to be talking right now about COVID and inflation. They're probably not talking about emerging technology with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? Or even like more specifically, like if I was looking for cards about like a US-China war, they might be like, China is considering like approaching into Taiwan. It's like that has nothing to do with whether or not we'll have cyber satellite ground stations, right? It's like, so it's like you can find sort of cards that are in there that are more specific. Once you find some of those examples, okay, it's not enough to just sort of like stop and be like, yeah, F card says NEG, the end, period, right? It's like you kind of want to then develop that set of arguments. So let's say, Taiwan example. I was like, I found a card that was like China pushing on Taiwan is a bigger all cause for war, emerging tech, very small all cause. It's like, okay, fair enough. What other cards would you want to sort of win that argument? So let's say that's like a cornerstone of your strategy. If you were get an ideal 2 and C, what would you want in addition to that? Yeah, so it would be nice to then cut an ancillary card that's like the plan doesn't really do a whole lot in the context of moving the needle on sort of China relations. You would also want a card that, especially if you're making an alternative cause argument, a reason why that alternative cause outweighs the set of things that are in the plan, right? So if I have some evidence that's just like, Taiwan is a big all cause, the second piece of evidence I want is like that China cares a lot more about Taiwan than it cares about emerging tech, or China, China's number one priority is to figure out the Taiwan issue, right? It's like that second card really makes sort of that first argument very good. It sort of stops the app from just being like, oh, we're a first step. It's like, you're not really a first step to anything. The first step would have been for fix Taiwan, right? It's like, that's kind of the set of cards that you'd be looking for in order to win. When you're sort of looking at these articles, you shouldn't just be looking for like, oh, like Urav concludes the other way. You should also be looking at footnotes. Okay, you should be looking at footnotes. So footnotes are like the little citations that like you'll see like little numbers in the text of something that indicates like certain articles that are being cited. And a lot of times, if you're looking at articles, most articles tend to be a little bit more reflexive than debate is. So like in debate, like our perfect card would like, not be all that, neg leaning or AF leaning. It would just be like, here's the terminal impact, it causes extinction. It says the words, the plan and the security cooperation, whatever in it, right? It's like, that would be nice. People who are writing in academia are not writing like, they usually include, for example, like, here are some responses that some people might make to my piece. And then they'll like cite a bunch of authors. They might respond to them, but it's like the footnotes will help you find a bunch of negative authors for disadvantages, counterplans, whatever else. And then you can sort of start researching not just from the 1AC article, but you'll find some other articles that'll help you develop some of your other negative positions, right? And I think that footnote part is really important to sort of establish that. Okay, once you've sort of read their 1AC articles, so that was like the first 3 steps, I think. The next step, the fourth step, is to think about which generic DAs and case turns fit the case and to think sort of strategically about that. So I think a lot of times people will go into a case neg, like pretending like they will know which off-case positions they will read and then generating a case debate. I think that's the wrong approach. It's like, you don't know before going in, for example, that the Department of Commerce counterplan that I suggested for the states or for the space thing exists, right? So it's like, if you went and be like, yeah, I'm going to read the DOS counterplan, it's like, well, like your DOS counterplan is like a B+ strategy right now because the word security cooperation is not in there. It's like a better strategy would have been to figure out that agent thing. So it's like, you kind of want to sequence it the other way. So it's like, you should look at their 1AC articles and be like, what is sort of the weakest place that this app is in? Then you should be like, okay, here are the generics that I'm going to work on and supplement. So let's say you decided you looked at an AF and you're like, this AF is pretty good about defending like the Department of Defense is important, but kind of ass about defending NATO. It's like, if that's the case, it's like, you should be putting together stuff for like the NATO bad style. Or if you're like, this card says, DOS, Department of Commerce, whoever can do it, it's like, you have no reason why the DO arguments to do it. So then it's like, okay, let me cut a link argument for the DoD budget DA and, write the counterplan that avoids using the DoD. That kind of makes sense. So it's like, you want to think about sort of what generics are best considering the set of case cards that you play. Okay. Then fifth thing, you should find links to those things. So it's like, we have DAs, obviously. It's like we have the DoD budget DA. I'm sure the people who are in my DoD budget group can attest to say that they're pretty good, but like not the highest quality disadvantage that we've ever written on every topic. Like, yeah, we have some link cards that say the phrase security cooperation. And like, we have some link cards that say like DoD, like overstretched, like Rosenberg was like, holy shit, we can't like retrain everybody each time they do a mission. Like there's some stuff to be said there, but it's not like that's not amazing, right? It's like, you want some cards that are like, okay, so like doing stuff with satellite ground stations in space is probably really expensive. So then it's like, you can find some cards now that are just like, oh yeah, the DoD budget DA, if that's going to be part of my strategy, it's really expensive to do satellite stuff. It pairs well with the Department of Commerce counterpart, right? So it's like, you'll cut specific links to the thing you're doing. Does that make sense? Those searches tend to be a lot more targeted. So those searches will be, and honestly, those targeted searches will be a little bit easier. So like, my guess is like, if you type in like space, satellites, expensive. It's like, my guess is that you'll probably come up with some stuff in Google that's just like, yeah, this stuff costs a lot, right? It's like, those will be a little bit easier to find than like the, overly general, like, can we find some cards that say security cooperation trades off within the DoD budget? It's like, those cards were very hard to find. It actually took the generic like days to figure that out. On the other hand, if I was like, go find some cards that say satellites are expensive, my guess is that most of you would be finished in the next 30 minutes, right? So it's like, you should do some of those targeted searches that are quick. And another one is like, if you're looking for cards for the DOS counterplan and you're looking for things specific to like space, I might literally just type in like Department of State space. It's like, what do they do in space? And it's like, now you have some cards that say the DOS can do stuff in space. So that kind of makes sense. So it's like, those targeted searches will help with that quite a bit. Step number 6. So we've done some policy stuff. Maybe we have some disads, we have some counterplans. Okay, the numbers might be off. Sorry, I definitely sort of winged that part. You're good. The next step that you want to do is sort of like read the 1AC again. Okay, read the 1AC again. And this is now for like K reasons. Okay, you should study how they've tagged arguments, and you should also figure out what they've underlined. And the things you're looking for, you should look for rhetorical tropes that you can pull in evidence. Okay, you should look for rhetorical tropes you can pull in evidence. Sometimes when you're reading a set of cards from the 1AC, there are some particular Ks that work better than others. Okay, there are Ks that work better than others. So like, if the impact evidence from the affirmative describes China as an irrational actor, right? My guess is that the better K to read is a K of rationality or rational actors in international relations than Wilderson, right? It's like, one is pretty generic and the other one is pretty specific to the idea of rationality. So it's like, the way you want to sort of pick your K against an F is less like, I like this K and then I'm going to jam it into this affirmative and like see how it goes. It should instead be like, oh, like, there's literally stuff written in the 1AC that's like super easy to establish a link. So the link's at 100% and they can't win a permutation in that world. So like, we're going to read that K instead, right? And like, that's kind of the way that you want to do it. So like, for example, the Virilio critique is pretty general, but the place where it does excel is that it has some pretty good link arguments about the idea of speed and, in this context, an arms race, literally racing for time against China, right? So it's like, if we have advantage link arguments, it's like, we need to really speed up. Like we don't have that much time to deliberate. It's like, well, like that is actually a pretty good link to the Virilio K, and that's a kind of 100%, right? Or like, for the security case stuff, it's like, you might have some specific cards about like techno-orientalism. It's like, given that, it's like, if they have a China advantage, they have some of those link arguments. It's like, you are in a much better place reading that argument than like, I don't know, like generic like FemIR stuff with no link, right? It's like, you want to like kind of decide based on what is the EV saying, and then it's like, what can I establish with the critique that I'm sort of establishing. You should also figure out, like, in terms of the critique, you want to make sure that the case arguments that you're writing fit well with the critique, right? So it can't be the case that you have a critique that's like, let's say Wilderson, okay? You decide that that's the K you're reading. It's like, can't really read the Wilderson K with like economic interdependence checks war. Like war will not happen because like all institutions, civil society is doing great. Like they check all war. It's like that makes no sense, right? It's like one of those things probably will delete all of civil society and interdependence. So it's like you want to make sure like the case arguments that you were like, oh yeah, these are the best case arguments align well with the critique you're reading. So it's like if I was reading a set of arguments about like interdependence, it's like my guess is that the better critique might be like security, right? I might be like, the idea that you've sort of like overhyped all these threats is really bad. It results in a bunch of neoconservative policies. And instead, we should be willing to think that, interdependence will check things like nuclear war. It's like those two things do fit together pretty well. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? So it's like you want to make sure your case arguments fit with the critique. Okay, last part, organizing and mapping the file out. Okay, organizing and mapping the file out. This is in theory number 7, but I might have numbered poorly. Few sort of thoughts about this. You want to create, so a little bit of this is going to sound a little obvious, but I'm just going to say it anyway. Like you should create sections for each position. We at North Broward, we had a case NEG for fracking, and it was totally unusable because it was just a pile of 150 cards. So like, I'm pretty sure we lost almost every fracking today. That wasn't ours. Like we literally just didn't know where anything was. So it was just like, yeah, let's collect a bunch of stuff in the 1NC, and then it was like, oh shit, like we just have like 300 cards of like nothing. So it's like it needs to be organized. Okay. Generally speaking, I would organize it based on like case stuff first. I would have like front lines to the advantage and 2NC extensions to advantages and add-ons. And then you should have some case specific off case strategies. And then I would have some generic links, all set by category. Okay. When talking about sort of 1NCs to case, your 1NCs to case should have a healthy mix of analytics and cards. Should have a healthy mix of analytics and cards. It should not just be like 4 impact D cards. It also should not just be you ranting about why the advantage sucks. It should be maybe a mix of the two things. Okay. So it needs to be a mix of, so for your case front lines for your advantage, it needs to be sort of a mix of analytic arguments. So like arguments that you're coming up with for why the advantage is incomplete, and also pieces of evidence. So it's like, usually when thinking about analytic arguments, right, you should think about just like your like gut reasons for why you think the advantage is not that great. So like for the water protection topic, I can think of 2 like really easy ones. Like if you debated that topic, like one was like when people read biodiversity advantages, like it didn't really make a lot of sense because those cards were talking about global biodiversity. The plan literally only saw biodiversity in the US because that's how topicality works. So it's like it didn't really make sense. Like biodiversity advantages, like China is fracking. Like what are you saying? Right? Is like a pretty good push that you might not have a card for, but it's like obviously the advantage is a 0. Another example is like modeling. It's like there was like guaranteed, like every person's modeling advantage last year was also like dog water, right? It was just like some random card that's like maybe people follow the US. So like, I don't know, if the US does something environmental, like China really wants to follow the US lead, like that's definitely in their MO. It's like what are we even saying? Right. So it's like you can make a set of like analytic pushes that are sort of similar to that. I think the thing that's similar is like pretty much every time somebody reads a modeling advantage on any topic, it usually is pretty bad for that reason. Because it's like you can have sort of the basic question that's like, if you're saying like Russia and China as an adversary, like why are adversaries following the United States? And like, if they're really thinking it's a race, it's like, why would they be like, if the US draws down, why would adversaries be like, yeah, let's also draw down so we can also lose the race? It's like, that makes no sense, right? Or, another set of analytics might be like, your EV is talking about emerging like disruptive technologies generally. Like, what do you do about nano or the other 2 areas in the topic or all of the other areas outside of the topic that are all technology related, right? It's like, it is unclear why only AI, only cyber, only whatever is the thing that really determines our race. So it's like analytics like that go a pretty significant way, especially if you like think that their evidence is kind of only half-assed, right? And I think sort of having a healthy mix of both is important. You should make sure to anticipate 2 AC arguments. So this goes without saying, but like not enough to just have a 1NC. Not enough to just have a 1NC and then like a few stray cards. You should figure out like, what do you think the aff will say in the face of your argument? And you should have some answers to that argument. So it's like, let's say like I read the Department of Commerce counterplan against the space app, and I'm like, your evidence says this. It's like the AT lab is not going to fold, right? Like 2AC is not going to be like, oh, sorry, like we just got our cards, so like bounce now, like debate over. Like they're probably going to say a couple things. They're probably going to be like, we have a DoD procurement advantage. So like, what are you saying? Like we should use the Department of Defense, obviously. They'll probably also be like firm to the counterplane, whatever. So it's like you need some 2 AC blocks that respond to each of the things that you would anticipate the affirmative saying. And you should expect that because in wave 3, once our case negs are written and we have our inter-lab debates, people are going to cut answers to the things that the other labs have produced, right? And the analog to this is like when you go back to your different schools, let's say you like pop someone in a case neg, like on a new case neg, that team isn't just going to be like, oh yeah, like fold, like every time we debate, we're just going to lose, right? Like they're going to fix the thing that they're going to do. Either, they might write a new affirmative, but more likely is like they're not going to start from scratch. They're just going to write a 2 AC block. So it's like you need to be able to make sure that you have some 2 ACs 2 NCs that answer some of those 2 AC arguments. You should organize cards into 1 NC and extensions. So here's sort of the thought. When you're going for case arguments, how many of you find it really helpful if you only have 1 NC cards and no cards for the block, for the case? Yeah, why does that suck? Yeah, exactly. So it's like you want some more cards, obviously, always. The thing that I usually suggest when putting together like case net, case frontline stuff is like you sort of want 2x plus 1 cards more than they've read. So it's like, I know that's like weirdly mathematical, but it's like the way that I sort of think about it is if they have 1 AF card saying like their thing, so like let's say they're saying AI is key. It's like if they have 1 card saying AI is key, I would want 3 cards that say AI is not key. Okay. And it's like those cards should not all say the same thing. They should say AI is not key for different reasons. So it's like they might be like AI is not key because nano is a bigger issue. AI is not key because Taiwan is a bigger issue. AI is not key because something else is a bigger issue, right? Like a different warrant for each one is kind of where you want to be. And sort of having multiple cards also makes the 1AR's life a lot more miserable, right? Because like they can't just, the 1AR faced with those 3 pieces of evidence can't just be like AI is key, C1 AC card. It's like, well, the neg job is now pretty easy. Like you could just be like, well, you're 3 to 1 right now. Like we have some neg cards that are pretty good that listed a bunch of other reasons that are really, really important that you've dropped, right? So it's like you want additional sort of frontline cards, like beyond the 1 NC frontline, like you get some 2 NC cards as well. Echoing sort of what I just said, it's like make sure the purpose of the card is not repetitive. Like make sure they have different tags, different warrants, different reasons why you have the argument. So sometimes, so it's like the easiest way is like you want different warrants for each argument. Sometimes you have things that are the same warrant, but you still want reasons why the cards have a different reason of being there. So like, let's say I find 2 cards that say Taiwan's more important. One is like written by, literally Chinese state propaganda, and the other one is written by a professor. The professor sounds a little bit more reasonable, like it's not like escalation is happening now, but like the Chinese propaganda one is like full, like we're gonna start a war with Taiwan. It's like, okay. It's like I might read one of the cards in the 1 NC, and then when the 2 AC inevitably makes a claim that's just like, dude, like your card is really biased and like what's wrong with you? Like the 2 NC can then read the same argument but from a professor, right? So it's like you can kind of have like that 1-2 where it's like the same argument is being echoed by a different set of people. And maybe like the Chinese propaganda card sounds rhetorically more powerful, so you like it in the 1 NC. But it's like in the 2 NC, you have some cards that are a little bit more academic and has like, different sets of warrants, right? Like sometimes it happens. Or like another instance is like date. So it's like you might have a card that's like pretty inferior in quality of warrant, but like says the claim only and then is from like today. And then you might have another card from like 2 weeks ago that's like really warranted, but it's kind of old. It's like in that case, it's like it says the same thing, but it does have a different purpose, which is like one of the cards, the point is like you're reading it because it's really new and you want to say it post dates. And then another card you're reading because you want to say like these are some of the warrants that matter, right? So it's like you want a reason why you're cutting cards that have distinct things. Otherwise, it's not necessary, right? So if you think it's identical, like identical in date, identical in terms of like expertise, identical in warrants, it's like in that case you should pick the one that is better, like just in your estimation. You should not include both into your speech. Make sense to everybody? Okay. That's sort of my spiel. Do folks have any questions or comments about how to write a case neg, or do folks have any questions about case negs that they're writing that they are feeling like they're in hot water for? Yeah. So a few thoughts, like a lot of the affirmatives that people will read will likely already exist in some way or another. So like before a year, like my suggestion would be if you really want to be prepared, at a national level, it would mean like you would want to write case negs during the summer to the affirmatives that are from the camps that people like to take them from. So in my experience, that usually is the University of Michigan 7-week seniors and juniors lab, and then the Dartmouth Debate Institute. Those are like the two places where people are taking affs, like copy and pasting. Or like they might have changes, but like it's only in the context of the advantage. So like it might be like, oh yeah, people are reading the space CMMC aff, but it's like advantage 2 is not procurement, like advantage 2 is now something else. So it's like, given that, the thing that you really want to do is you want to establish a set of case negatives to affirmatives that are being written by camp before you get, okay? In the rare situation that a team is not reading a camp aff, and I say rare because it really is rare. Like, in my opinion, like in September, most of the time, people are reading affirmatives produced by camp or derived from camp. And I would say like maybe like 20% of the time people are reading affirmatives, like completely new. Okay. For the completely new version, it's like, yeah, you might get popped the first time. My suggestion would be to have some generics ready, right? So it's like generics like the DOS, counterplay, and the critique are helpful for like your first wave of things. But once you get the affirmative, you should be able to sort of then take it home and research it for the next tournament, right? So it's like, you don't want sort of a static case neg. If you're like, oh yeah, like our neg is pretty bad here, like we need to go fix our stuff. It's like you should fix it and do sort of this process before the next tournament. And usually speaking, the newer the affirmative is, the worse their evidence is going to be. So it's like all of the, so like think about it this way, right? All the affs that were really easy to find, we found them at camp, like in 1 week, right? Most of the things that they're finding are like probably pieced together like from a bunch of stuff that like is kind of questionable, and then like is the point of reading it is the shock effect that it's new as opposed to like it's good. So it becomes a lot easier to do that case neg process when you get back and you're like, oh, all their solvency evidence is clearly pretty bad, and there's a reason why we didn't cut it at the DDI, or there's a reason why nobody else thought about this, right? And that's sort of the process you take. Hopefully that answers your question. Cool. Any other questions about case negs or case negs you are writing? Yeah. It'll probably start by taking you some time. I would say, like, since you're reading all their 1AC articles and starting from scratch a lot of times, I would say that it would take like a good like day. Like it like for me initially when I started, it would take me about 8 hours. It's like that's quite a long time, but if you parse it out like through the week, like if you did like an hour per week, it's like not so bad. If it's like I did it in the 8 hours before a tournament, like sucks. But it's like that's usually how it took. I think you get a lot faster the more you do it because you'll start to get some intuition about like what is bad about an aff. So like the more you read about a topic, the more you'll be able to be like, this doesn't really pass the sniff test of why NATO is key. But like this doesn't really pass the sniff test of why the DoD is key. It's like once you start getting that intuition, your work will be a lot faster. I would say like right now, if you ask me to write a case neg, it takes me about 2 hours. So like it takes me usually the time to like debate start and then debate end. And like the goal for me is like, so like for example, if we're debating in the octas, we're debating a team in the quarters, like I would want to have the case neg to the quarters team by the end of the debate. But that does require a lot of practice. Yeah. Yes. The reason is because just thinking about it like just logically, it's like a lot of the camp negs are nothing. So it's like, and even if they're good, a lot of times there's like, I like to call this like there's like diamonds in the rough. Like there are some like really good cards here and there. And there's some cards that literally do not approximate the tag. Like there are some cards that are like not verbatim, like literally says the opposite thing and are like unworkable. Right. So it's like the thing that you want to like do in the preseason is if there is already a case neg, and this is something that I've been doing. I literally have a file titled quality control where I've only taken the cards that I thought were like readable and good and put them in the quality control file and then literally deleted everything else out of the file. And like at the end of the summer, I'm probably going to take the quality controlled cards and then put them into case negs. And then after that, I can figure out like what's missing. So it's like right now we have some pretty good advantage stuff. from these camps, but like nothing on the counterpoint, or this ad is unworkable, so it got deleted out of the case neg. Right? It's like that's kind of the process that you sort of want to do for each case neg, if that makes sense. But yeah, I literally have a file that's titled Quality Control University of Michigan, and so far out of the like 40 files that they've produced, I have retained 30 cards. Well, you usually start with their articles. It's like you read their articles. It's like, I would say reading all of their articles that they have in the 1AC will take you like 2 hours, okay, when you're starting. Because it's like you're not skimming, you're like literally reading top to bottom, right? Then sort of like the next set of things you want to do is like, what is weak about this? And then it's like you can cut some of the cards. That'll probably take you a couple of hours. And then finally, it's like, which off-case arguments do I need to supplement? So if you're like, oh yeah, this thing doesn't have a DOD key warrant, it's like I might cut like 2 cards about why the DLS can do their thing. It's like that is usually like another, if you're like a slower card cutter, probably like 2 hours. I know that's like, it's not a science, so like it might take you longer. Like I'm not, I'm not saying like this is like always the way that works. And it's like now it takes me a lot less time because it's like I know what I'm reading for. So it's like I'm able to skim a lot of these articles. I'm not like reading full chapters anymore because it's like I now have a pretty decent intuition that's like, this doesn't have a DOD keyboard. It's like, okay, well, like now I'm reading for that. It's like, does this article say the word DOS should? It's like I've controlled F Department of State should. It's like, oh, found it, right? Or like so things like that. So it's like that usually is sort of built throughout a topic, and then also the more you write case snakes, the more you're like, this is usually the weakness of these sets of affirmatives. Yeah. You kind of have to read their 1AC articles, and I think it's a process. So like you'll kind of notice that a lot of affirmatives on this topic, even though the plans are different, are quite similar in their theme, right? So it's like advantage one is the arms race. X technology, we're losing now. We need to win. We need some standards and some norms. Mm-hmm. Like, are you talking about writing a case neck to a Baudrillard F? Is that what you're asking? Or are you saying like if you want to read the Baudrillard K on the negative? Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think the easy and hard answer is like reading. So it's like you do need to read their stuff, and it's like most of what I know about debate doesn't come from like nowhere. It's because I did like the first like couple of case negs I wrote, it took forever. Like it literally felt like I was pulling teeth. And when I say like 8 hours, like I don't mean like 8 hours with Facebook. I mean like 8 hours no internet, like articles collected, and literally just did debate work. And so like that's tough and kind of brutal. But it's like once you do it a few times, you'll start being able to form like connections between like different arguments and figuring out like what things are saying. The other part of it is like experience debating too. So it's like hearing some of these people debate, listening to sort of like later out rounds where these arguments are being produced, and especially at a high level, you'll sort of get the feeling that's like, oh, these are the things that the AF really wants to say or really wants to conclude within the 2AR. So it's like we need some cards that respond to that. It's like, okay, it's like now that you have that knowledge, it's like you can go back to the article and be like, do these cards really say the things the 2AR is saying? What are some of the like flaws? What are some of the things the 1AC didn't do? Right? It's like that's kind of the thing that you need to do. But it's like, yes, yes. In fact, it actually, in fact, it's better that way because like you don't want to go and be like, we're reading the DOS CPU. Like it might be the case that the Department of Commerce counterplan is insane and you never knew about it, or like the G, like the so for example, the NATO pick group put out the G20 like pick. I didn't even think about that. Like I had no idea. So it's like now I'm like, oh, I should be reading for some of this stuff about G20, right? So it's like reading some of these case cards will help you retain some knowledge. It's like, oh, these are possible negative strategies that like could exist. Yeah. 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 exactly. So it's like when you're putting together a large 1 and C, it's like, this might be a little contrary to what I'm saying. It's like, Virlio might go into every 1 and C, or like the conditions counterplan. I really like it. I could go for it. It's going into every 1 and C. But it's like the rest of the other off case positions hopefully have some specific things going on with the aff. So it's like you have some generics that are fail safes that you could go for regardless of affirmative. But it's like you should also have some stuff that's like, okay, like we have some specific things against your stuff. It's like, having both will really pressure the other team, right? Because they'll know, like, they'll be like, oh, this team can go for the really okay, but it's also now a little frightening that they also have like 3 or 4 other positions that like cut R1AC articles. Like one of the examples of this, like we debated this team from Cypress Bay when they were pretty good, and they had like an affirmative about nanotechnology like a few years ago on the China topic. It wasn't a camp aff, so it was like kind of hard to debate them with just like camp stuff, and it was also kind of hard to find nano cards about your back files because that wasn't the topic. But like we ended up doing a case neg that like included a counterplan from their solvency advocate, a disad from their solvency advocate, topicality cards from the solvency advocate, a case from solvency advocates that said their aff was not enough. And it's like, yeah. So like their solvency advocate was like, here's a bunch of other recommendations that are not the plan itself. And so like we cut that and they were deleted after 1 and C, right? It's like, it's tough because it's like, we had our normal strategies. So like in that context, one of our teams was pretty good at reading Wilderson. So it's like the Wilderson K was in there, but like we also had like 7 other things that were about the aff. So their 2 AC allocation was destroyed basically. Yeah. Hmm? I would say a few things. There's like, this is a little bit separate from case neg stuff, but I would say like there are lectures online. Like I know, like for example, the Georgetown debate seminar has had like lectures on like topicality theory, arguments, conditionality, bad, etc. for a while. So it's like listening to some of those. I would like pick a day where you're like not doing research stuff and just like dedicated to how do you start building your own topicality files? Not quite. So topicality, I would say like I would figure out what all the affirmatives are, and then I would also figure out like what T violations were written at camp. So that might be more of a collective job. It's like fair enough for that one. Theory, I usually say that people should write their own theory blocks. Copy pasting theory blocks is like the easiest way for you to lose because you won't know how to explain the thing. So it's like if somebody goes for conditionality bad, it's like I would take a gander and say most of you who have written a theory block are going to be like, uh-oh, like we have a 2 and C block for conditionality is good, but like I'm just going to reread it and be like, right, as opposed to like actually debating it. So like my suggestion for that is, for conditionality in particular, right, I might collect all conditionality blocks I've had from, teammates, camps, whatever. Then the next step would be like figure out what all of them say, and then be like create your own that like optimizes word economy, so it's like efficient. Take the arguments where you're like, oh, I understand that argument, so I will put it into the block because I can't explain it. It's sort of the way that you want to sort of put together that. So I would like suggest like rewriting some of the theory files that you have, so like it's in your voice and you can explain it when push comes to shove and they're going for that argument. Yeah. Cool. If you have any further questions, feel free to email me or like pull me aside at lunch or something like that. And yeah.